Welcome to Mexico Matters, the CSIS podcast about how events occurring in Mexico can impact and, more importantly, matter in the United States. I am Mariana Campero, non-resident senior associate of the Americas program at CSIS and the former CEO of the Mexican Council on Foreign Relations, COMEXI. Although deaths from overdose have fallen for the first time since 2020, more than 107,000 people died in the United States in 2023, 75% of which involved opioids. To discuss how Mexican cartels, aided by misguided policies, corruption, weak institutions, sophisticated weaponry, and large amounts of money that have fueled this epidemic, and what could President Trump and Claudia Sheinbaum actually do to reduce their power and influence, that it is truly my pleasure to welcome Vanda Felbab-Brown, Senior Fellow at Brookings, Director of the Nonstate Armed Actors Initiatives, and Co-Director of the series The Opioid Crisis in America, Domestic and International Dimensions. Vanda, welcome to Mexico Matters. It's truly a privilege to have you again on the show.
Thank you so much. It's great to be back with you.
So, you really have been at the forefront and you have been studying the global synthetic drug revolution for years now. Actually, I don't know if there's anybody on the planet that knows more about this subject than you do. Let me really ask you, Vanda, what makes this drug epidemic so unprecedented? I mean, over 700,000 people, more or less, have died in the United States in a decade due to fentanyl. Can you give us the context?
Yeah, absolutely. So, synthetic opioids are not just any drugs. What is unique about them is that they are so enormously potent that extraordinary small amounts can kill. The Drug Enforcement Administration campaign that one pill can kill, it's not an exaggeration. And of course, these drugs, fentanyl and its various analogs, are mixed into most drugs in the United States, probably all drugs today. And this is done by dealers, by wholesale traffickers, groups like the Sinaloa Cartel and Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, to get many more people addicted to them. But it's also done because the drugs are enormously easy to produce, very cheap from the production perspective. And because they are so potent, they are also so deadly. But it also means that very small amounts of them are sufficient to supply very large drug markets. So despite the fact that the drugs have devastating effects on users, that they push up lethality to these extraordinary levels that you were mentioning, they are very appealing to traffickers. And around the world, synthetic drugs, such as mostly methamphetamine, are spreading. The meth is becoming more potent. In the United States, the Mexican meth has become very potent. The levels of purity and potency are very high. Methamphetamine itself today is killing tens of thousands of Americans yearly, not as much as fentanyl, but it's just part and parcel of this synthetic drugs revolution that you talked about. So far, there has been nothing more potent than synthetic opioids. Now, there are other synthetic opioids than just fentanyl. For example, nitazines that are emerging in Europe and that are also entering the US market.
Vanda, two questions. First, why are the suppliers making their products so lethal? I mean, if you look at it from a business perspective, why would it make sense to kill my customer? And the other question is, can you explain to us what role have the Mexican cartels played in the fentanyl epidemic?
So today, the predominant suppliers of fentanyl and, for that matter, any other drug to the United States are the two large Mexican cartels, the Sinaloa Cartel and Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación. Now, as we speak in the beginning of December, we can question and get in the conversation on whether the Sinaloa cartel still exists, whether it will exist. They synthesize fentanyl in Mexico from precursor chemicals they import out of China. Now, they make the decisions as producers about how lethal and potent to make it. I was speaking about the fact that from trafficking perspective, from evading law enforcement, evading control, simplifying logistics, The more potent the drug, the better. Instead of having to smuggle 10 trailer trucks of cocaine, which is how much it used to take to supply the US market, you can smuggle maybe 1/10 or less than that in fentanyl to supply the entire market. But the downside is, of course, this enormous lethality, which, Mariana, goes to your questions. Why are they not upset about killing the customers? And we actually have some stunning answers to that. In the spring of 2023, the US Department of Justice released the indictments against the Chapitos, the sons of Joaquim El Chapo Guzman, notorious trafficker now in the Supermax in the United States. His sons took over the running at least one branch of the Sinaloa cartel. And these wiretaps go to about 2015, 2016, some later, or at least we assume they are wiretaps in the indictment. And they have these conversations in which the Chapitos are talking precisely about this fact. And they discuss, for example, a very potent batch of fentanyl that they know is lethal, that it's so potent that for sure will kill customers. And they have this conversation about, should we send it, should we hold it back? And it would be very cheap for them to stop it. The drugs are so easy to replace, it's minimal loss. And they still make the decision to send it. And they say, it doesn't really matter how many people we kill in the United States because we will just get so many more people addicted. We will create streets of American junkies. Now, this is an extraordinary conversation, and it's been a key feature in the indictments. It's been a key reason why the United States has been so motivated to go after the Chapitos. Two of them are now in US prison. And it's astounding because the Mexican cartels, including Sinaloa, behave very differently in Mexico than in the United States. In Mexico, they're very violent. They kill tens of thousands of people per year, 30,000 people for year and year and year now. Most of these are organized crime linked homicides. But in the United States, the cartels actually directly, through violence, through guns, kill very few people. They are not principal sources of homicides because they fear law enforcement. Now, this has not been the case, however, with the impact of fentanyl deaths. Somehow, they were just totally indifferent to the law enforcement pressure this would trigger. And of course, the societal whole of government, whole of society reaction this would trigger. And it's also fascinating because there may be changes. So last year, in 2023 at the end, and across 2024, for the first time in years, we are seeing both declines in overdoses as well as declines in the purity of fentanyl. There are many explanations about why this could happen. But the fact that fentanyl is less pure, which has now been confirmed by the administrator of the Drug Enforcement Administration, El Mingram, in a recent interview, she said that for years the potency of fentanyl was such that at least 70% of amounts would contain a lethal overdose, and now it's down to 5, so decreases in purity. It's possible that this has come as a result of the actions of the Chapitos, that they finally came to understand as a result of US enforcement that they can be no less indifferent to the deaths of people from overdose as they are to deaths from killing in the United States. Now, there are many possibilities of why purity might have gone down. One possibility is that we simply have far more seizures at the US border. And we have seen big increases in seizures. But seizures, you never know. Have your seizures gone up because you are much more effective? Instead of catching 10% of the product, you're now catching 40%? Or is it because there is much more drugs coming in? So, uncertainty. But there is the possibility that the Chapitos have decided to reduce the purity because they are so afraid of US law enforcement. I was in Mexico in 2023 during various periods, including several times in Sinaloa. And I was first in Sinaloa just when the first murders started appearing in Culiacan and elsewhere, and first narcomantas proclaiming that the Chapitos have issued a ban on fentanyl production. that they were no longer allowing it. I was quite skeptical of the claim. I didn't really believe they intended to do that. I was back there several months later, and still the information coming from people on the street, law enforcement, journalists, people who had been involved in the drug trade was that, yeah, the cooks were out of business, various local brokers were out of business because the Chapitos maintained the ban. And they wanted, my supposition was, and this was coming from other information as well, that they wanted to move production out of Culiacan, the headquarters of the Sinaloa cartel, to take away focus of law enforcement from them in their home place, in their headquarters. And that they were moving production both closer to the border between US and Mexico, but also to places like Chiapas and maybe even Guatemala. And I think it's possible that this was part of a strategy by them to reduce the law enforcement heat, to move production where they were not so closely associated with it. And it's possible they also became more mindful about sending lethal overdoses. Now, look, this is all speculation, but we can have the answer. Two of the Chapitos are in prison, as is the head of the rival branch, Elmayo Zampada. And so, U.S. law enforcement can ask them those questions, and hopefully they'll be surfaced in the trials that are coming up.
No doubt, Vanda. Hopefully we will get those answers in the upcoming trials. You mentioned the word heat. So talking about heat, President Trump has threatened to impose 25% tariffs on Mexico if we don't stop the flow of fentanyl and people. Regardless of whether or not it is a good idea to reduce the whole relationship on these two issues, can you give us a sense of what could Mexico actually do that it has not done in practical terms that could make a difference?
So indeed, there is the threat by incoming President Trump of imposing 25% tariffs specifically linked to fentanyl, as well as undocumented migrants. Issued that threat to Mexico, to Canada, and is issued a separate threat of additional fentanyl tariffs to China. Now, this is, of course, in the context of the incoming president proclaiming to impose all kinds of other tariffs across the board related simply to trade and to what he believes is a need to move manufacturing and production to the United States. Now, it is absolutely unrealistic that Canada, Mexico, and China can stop all flow of contraband and undocumented people across the border. It's feasible for Canada to some extent with respect to fentanyl because we get essentially no Canadian fentanyl. There is vast production of fentanyl in Canada. It's not done by the Mexican cartels. It's done independently of them. And that fentanyl stays in Canada and is killing a lot of people in Canada. Stunningly, the Mexican cartels deeply operate in Canada in the methamphetamine market, but the fentanyl market is divided at the US-Mexico border. In the little amount of fentanyl that might be coming from Canada, perhaps could be reduced, but the amounts are so small that they are really irrelevant. The bulk of the trade goes across the US-Mexico border, the vast predominant amount of the trade. No country has the capacity to just seal the border to the extent there would be no fentanyl, or no drugs, no contraband. It is clear, however, that the Mexican government during the previous administration of Andrés Manuel López Obrador liquidated meaningful cooperation with the United States in law enforcement and equally problematically liquidated its own law enforcement response to the criminal groups in Mexico, with the power of the Narcos growing to unprecedented level, expanding to legal economies, expanding geographically, infecting and dominating institutions, deeply influencing elections in Mexico. I don't use this lightly, but I did believe that at the end of the López Obrador administration, Mexico did stand on the verge of becoming a narco state. Or maybe perhaps it was a narco state, a government where the power of the criminal groups to subvert the system, to dominate the system, to affect not just law enforcement outcomes, but political outcomes, to control legal economies was really critical. So I think that we need far more cooperation. But this notion that you slap a tariff and Mexico stops the trade really misunderstands the mechanics of the trade and the complexities of it. There is no doubt that there is significant corruption across levels of institutions and governments in Mexico, but even a very determined administration in a Mexican government, in a Mexican leading role, just doesn't have a magic wand to turn it off. Now, I think there is a way, however, to turn this threat and through creative and thoughtful diplomacy, move instead to resurrecting meaningful law enforcement cooperation. That would include sustained, engaged presence of US law enforcement officials in Mexico. That would involve working with committed authorities to clear out the corruption levels from Mexico judicial system, something likely to get far worse with the election of judges in Mexico, given the power of the Narcos to shape elections, to build investigative bodies, and really to also focus on how to productively engage with the Mexican military, now in lead of law enforcement institution, and look at its own dirty laundry, which is substantial. So it's no easy task, but if we imagine sort of going back to much more joint effort that is not reduced to unachievable objectives or is not reduced to just high value targeting and placating the US with declaring certain amount of labs busted, but goes against structures of criminal groups and brings in Mexico's own need to reverse, to roll back the power of the narcos, we could move to a much better era than we were, frankly, in the previous 6 years. Now, that there's a big task. This is not so far what the Trump administration has put on the table. It has put on a very dramatic demand with very dramatic threat. That's also underpinned by a great desire among many people close to the Trump administration to designate the Mexican cartels as terrorist organization and frequent talk about U.S. military unilateral actions into Mexico. It would be highly explosive and, in my view, deeply counterproductive and not achieve any significant reduction of the fentanyl flow or of the power of the groups.
Absolutely. I mean, you're absolutely right that Mexican cartels now control large swaths of the territory. As you said, they're involved not only in the illegal activities that we know, like the trafficking of drugs, the trafficking of people, but also in avocados, in limes, in fisheries, as you know, you have done a lot of work on that subject. And it is also true, as you said, that during the López Obrador administration, the cooperation that existed between the two countries was basically annihilated, right? So before I ask you to move on to, are you optimistic or not in, Trump 2.0 and Claudia Sheinbaum being able to work together to rebuild this trust, let me just add another layer of complexity, which is the Chinese factor, which you have also done a lot of work on that. Reading your reports, the Chinese are not only involved in the selling of precursors to Mexico, but are also helping the Mexican cartels in laundering money. So can you tell us a little bit about that? And then we can tie sort of all of this. What can we do to make an impact on this?
Let me talk about the role of Chinese trafficking networks. And we really need to be careful here to specify that just as with Mexico, we are talking about the criminal networks, not the entire people of Mexico or China, or for that level government. And the issue of government complicity is a complex one and frequently alleged. But we're really talking about Chinese criminal organizations.
Correct. The mafias, let's say.
Right. Well, the mafias would be giving them way too much glamour
Okay.
because there is actually a striking difference between the types of criminal actors that smuggle precursor chemicals from China to the Mexican cartels and the Mexican cartels. So in Mexico, the Sinaloa cartel, Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, they are truly mafias. They are in legal economies. They have political influence. They usurp political roles. They are involved in really just about any economic activity in Mexico. The degree to which they are involved is very different, but they are involved just about in every economic activity. They have direct bearing on the issue of nearshoring or friendshoring. They threaten it in very many ways. They charge their own tariffs, they charge tax on just about everything. And, this is kind of winked away often in Mexico. And I often hear Mexican business community people not really to focus on that. But I think there is a real question about the extent to which the United States can risk legally, otherwise, to integrate with essentially narco economy, unless we see some significant resurrection of law enforcement efforts of rule of law in Mexico. But the Chinese traffickers of precursors are not these kind of actors. They are by and large small family-based organizations. They are called drug trafficking organizations, but they are not the big Chinese organized crime, the 14K big circle boys type of actors. They are, Bamboo United. They are not these large quote-unquote triads, the powerful mafias in the Chinese Asia space that we think about. They are much lesser guys. And that's because the precursor chemicals for fentanyl are actually very cheap, and so they are for the matter for methamphetamine. It's almost not been worth for the big Chinese criminal cartels or Chinese criminal groups to be involved. Now, the Chinese criminal groups are the big powerful ones, 14K, are spreading around the world. They are dominating not just the crime space in East Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia, Asia Pacific region, but they are expanding in Latin America in a variety of economies. And they often can do so because they serve all kinds of purposes and interests of the Chinese government. There is a degree of tolerance on the part of Chinese governing authorities of groups that provide them with corruption networks, that build political influence for them. They are part of the informal underground diplomacy, influence building, and they also serve as eyes on the Chinese diaspora and informal monitors of the Chinese diaspora. They are part of the authoritarian system that the Chinese Communist Party maintains around the world. But this is the big groups. The fentanyl smugglers are much smaller groups, often family-based networks that might be selling chemicals legally. They partially sell them legally. They might sometimes be involved in other illegal economies. It's become fairly regular that fentanyl precursors, meth precursors get bartered for wildlife products in Mexico, species that are harvested illegally and that threaten, and the harvesting of which, poaching of which threatens biodiversity in Mexico. But they're smaller groups. Now, the interesting aspect are the money laundering groups that span both the big Chinese criminal triads and the smaller actors. So over the past several years, one of the big shakeups in the underworld around the globe has been the rise of Chinese money laundering networks globally. They have for 2-3 decades dominated money laundering in Asia, in Australia, New Zealand, in that space. But over the past 5-6 years, they have catapulted themselves to the top money laundering entities for the Mexican cartels. Their power has grown enormously in the United States. They dominate money laundering for Italian mafia groups. Their spread in Europe is probably far greater than many publics and law enforcement actors in Europe, in fact, realize. So they have very significant power. They feature a wide set of actors, both large 14K triad type actors, to much smaller, I don't want to say quite mom and pop networks, but much smaller networks. They are connected to a variety of illegal economies, including, stunningly, in the United States. They've been investing some of their proceeds to both smuggle Chinese migrants into the United States and essentially enslave them in cannabis plantations, illegal cannabis plantations in the US. So, really fascinating element here. You have many US jurisdictions moving to legalize recreational cannabis, right? And often the argument for legalization is this will eliminate organized crime role. And we have certainly seen the Mexican cartels falling out of the cannabis trade. They don't bother to smuggle marijuana from the US-Mexico border, and they have really liquidated their cannabis operations in the US. But now you have the Chinese money laundering groups moving into this. And yet this is something that doesn't bring much money, especially with the price of legal pot declining rapidly. So the question is why? And there is yet much to be learned. The law enforcement has only recently realized that this is happening and that it's spreading dramatically. But some of the bits that we know is that the money laundering networks, the Chinese money laundering networks, see this as a low risk activity with minimal focus for law enforcement and a springboard and enabling operation for other criminal activities. So something that we need to pay very close attention to, including because of the risks around the world of connections between crime and state, which, actually is something that is not new, but has risen in prominence recently as well with the global great power competition, the rivalries between China and the United States, Russia's egregious invasion of Ukraine. We see more and more clandestine spy espionage efforts recruiting criminal actors. And this is also true about the government of India recruiting criminals for assassinations in Canada. It is true about a wide set of actors, Iran, a prominent one. There are big risks of Russian spy networks trying to recruit criminals in Mexico. And so another reason to be really paying close attention to the proliferation of the Chinese money laundering networks is the possible connections to other crime and the Chinese state.
Vanda, in addition to the drug seizures that we see on television on a regular basis, or the capturing of cartel heads like El Chapo or El Chapito or El Mayo that appear basically in every newspaper around the world, why is it that we don't hear as much about authorities going after the money? Is the US government, the Treasury, using all its might to go after these money laundering networks that you talk about? Or is the perception true that they're not really doing enough?
Mariana, I actually don't think that there is very little talk, let alone little awareness about the importance of going after the money. You often hear critics of law enforcement efforts as saying, well, if only you stop doing high-value targeting and went after the money, you would be so much more efficient. And of course, this is true. But there is a naivete about how easy that is. And in fact, we have seen decades of US efforts to go after criminal money. The Department of Treasury and other US law enforcement agencies, the whole panoply of US law enforcement agencies, all have built up sections that are devoted to detecting criminal money and going after it, using it to identify networks and to seize the money. But we have never really been in a situation where anti-money laundering networks have bankrupted any major criminal group, or for that matter, a terrorist group, perhaps with the exception of Al-Qaeda, because it's an enormous challenge. So this is a great tool. It's a tool that needs to be emphasized, that needs to be highlighted. It appropriately is something that's been part of US-Mexico collaboration. It needs to strengthen, but there are very many ways to launder money. And it's not just cryptocurrencies, but it's trade-based money laundering, which brings us back to the Chinese groups. Why are the Chinese groups at the top of the global money laundering pyramid? Because China trades in legal trade with just about every country in the world. And so you have extraordinary volumes of legal transactions that allow you to hide both cash or that allow you to bypass cash and be essentially in a barter-like system. We don't have Bolivian money laundering networks dominating the world because there are only so many countries that Bolivia is engaged in a fig trade with. So going after the money, yes, absolutely crucial. Frankly, the US has done a lot, but it is hard. We can always we need to do more, but it's not like this is not part of the quiver of law enforcement. I would also add here that as the US was confronting fentanyl during the Biden administration, the DEA made some important strategic decisions, one of which is that it made effort to move away from high-value targeting. I frankly don't know how easily that was executed and how extensively that was executed abroad. Certainly with the Chapitos, the focus has been on the Chapitos and the top enforcers. But domestically, the efforts included various operations, such as Operations Overdrive and Operations Last Mile, that sought to round up many of the medium-level distributors, low-level distributors. We will have many people that will say, oh, we shouldn't go after the low-level dealers, something we can debate. But the effort was to move away from just going after the heads. And accompanying element of that was also to really expand the anti-money laundering operations, both with Mexico and, very importantly, with China.
Vanda, we're coming to the end of this episode, but before I let you go, let me just ask you if you can explain the increase in violence that we're seeing in some parts of Mexico right now, basically due to a war between two factions of the Sinaloa cartel, El Chapito on one side and El Mayo on the other side, who are fighting for betrayal and for who will keep the territory. And on the other side, you have the Jalisco cartel, who sees this war and are also trying to get in to gain territory. Can this be an opportunity for the United States and Mexico to cooperate and really go after them? Or will we just let this opportunity go to waste? What is your take?
Well, we already have a big explosion in violence. Culiacan and Sinaloa more broadly have really been reeling with unused, atypical levels of violence to which the city and the state are not used to since Joaquim Guzman, one of the Chapitos, kidnapped his god uncle El Mayo, the partner and co-founder of the Sinaloa cartel El Chapo. And even prior to that kidnapping, there were many tensions and outright warfare between the two factions, and also with the third faction of Caro Quintero, known as Caborca. So a lot of the violence in Baja California, Baja California Sur, across 23, 24, entailed the factions fighting with each other. But it's really gotten dramatically bad, including in the headquarters after the kidnapping. And certainly if the Sinaloa Federation does splinter, this will have repercussions, including violent repercussions across the Americas. And it will have repercussions on global drug markets all the way to Australia and New Zealand. We don't yet know how it will work out. Will the Mayos or the Chapitos win? The Chapitos, the rumors go, have made the pact with their arch rival, El Mencho and the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación. We don't know what, this has not been confirmed yet, but a stunning choice if that is the case. Will that help them? Will they get absorbed by Jalisco? But it has big impact, not just among the two arch rivals, Jalisco and Sinaloa, but also because of the rise of Primeiro Comando da Capital, a Brazilian criminal group mafia that is now also trading cocaine around the world. Now, what does this mean for US-Mexico collaboration? Look, I think it's important for the collaboration to be anchored in Mexico's own realization that taking on the criminal groups is good for Mexico. This is not simply shoved down their throats by the gringos. That cooperation should not only be because Trump is threatening tariffs or because they're bargaining with the Biden administration, but because not living under the tyranny, the political tyranny, the economic tyranny of criminal groups is in the interest of the Mexican people, and because the Mexican state has become so hampered in its ability to design policy, to implement policy, because of the narcos. However, reducing violence needs to be a crucial element of that. And I think very naively, the López Obrador administration thought if it gave a carte blanche to the cartels, if it didn't challenge them with law enforcement, they would settle their turfs and the country would become less violent. In fact, it didn't happen at all. When López Obrador came to office, there were about 24 homicides per 100,000. When he left, there were 25, and very many people disappeared. Most of them have been murdered. So reducing violence needs to be a crucial part of the strategy. And there needs to be genuine commitment by the United States to work with Mexico to design policies that crucially seek to reduce violence, in addition to crucially seeking to reverse the power of the criminal groups. So I'm hoping that the explosion of violence in Sinaloa, awful as it is, and much as it must be brought down, will be a wake-up call for Mexican authorities as well as Mexican people that living under the narco peace is not sufficient, that the narco peace only exists at the mercy of the narcos, and when it goes wrong, it tremendously hurts the state and it tremendously hurts the people. And under the cloud of these dramatic threats and unachievable objectives, creative diplomacy emerges between the incoming Trump administration and the Sheinbaum administration already in office that develops policies that are sustained, sustainable, and that seek to reduce violence and power of the criminal groups, as well as to mitigate the dangerous harms such as fentanyl trafficking.
Vanda, I certainly hope You're absolutely right. And I agree with you that it is in the interest of Mexico and the Mexican people to cooperate with the United States because, as we've seen also, fentanyl use is growing in Mexico. Students are being recruited to work for the cartels, and the whole economy is now being controlled by the narcos. So it is not only in the interest of the United States that Mexico cooperates, it is also in the interest of the Mexican people. I hope President Claudia doesn't take this as an invasion of our sovereignty, but as an opportunity to really recuperate the sovereignty of Mexico.
Indeed, I think that is the framing that diplomacy needs to take. How do we recuperate Mexico's sovereignty? How do we reduce the harm in the United States? And how can we do it in productive, collaborative, sustained ways, as opposed to feel good but ineffective and counterproductive dramatic actions such as any kind of US unilateral military airstrikes.
Vanda, thank you so very much. It was great to see you. And as always, enlightening and very, very harsh conversation, but hopefully very, very useful.
Thank you for having me, Mariana, and for taking on some really tough topics.
If you enjoyed this podcast, check out our larger suite of CSIS podcasts. From Into Africa, The Asia Chessboard, China Power, AIDS 2020, The Trade Guys, Smart Women, Smart Power, and more. You can listen to them all on major streaming platforms like iTunes and Spotify. Visit csis.org/podcasts to see our full catalog